Good evening. Welcome back to the Canadian Orthodox Monastery of All Saints of North America. We've been off the air for a little while. I was traveling, speaking in Carleton University and in Toronto and other places in Ottawa. And I just returned, and I'm going to be a little bit technical this evening because a question came up whilst I was giving a talk that I wanted to respond to in a certain way just for Orthodox people. And the question happens that sometimes we encounter a question at the end of a talk, and we realize that in the time we have and within the framework of the discussion, we're not going to be able to respond properly. And in this case, I want to discuss the one particular question and a few rather technical things for Orthodox people, who, particularly ones who give talks or is put upon to give answers to questions in a time frame and within a context that one really can't respond in an appropriate manner. And then afterwards, we'll continue with The Old Testament is About You by going into the book of Exodus and look at some of the historical verifications of some of the incidents in Exodus that have been found, but most of all, to show the way that the entire story in the Old Testament, all the narratives, really are about humanity and a revelation about humanity that we can apply to each and every one of us. Now, in the question that I was asked at Carleton University, I made the mistake of thinking that the questioner was Coptic Orthodox, and so I responded with a quotation from Abba Anthony the Great. I was a little startled to find out to see from the response that the young man who asked the question had no idea who Abba Anthony was. So of course he couldn't have been a Coptic Orthodox Christian, because no one would know Abba Anthony the Great better than Coptic Orthodox Christians. I had mentioned about the fact that God does not change his attitude toward mankind, and quoted St. Abba Anthony when he said that God is always love, never has any other disposition or any other attitude at all. That doesn't change. And the young man asked me, well, is God unchangeable? Well, in the context of the changing of his attitude toward mankind, I said, well, yes, God is unchangeable. He has one disposition at all times toward mankind. And then he began to answer with some scholastic syllogisms. Well, look, if God is unchangeable, then if he created the universe, he existed outside the universe, and after he created the universe, he exists within the universe, and that's a change. So he said, God is either changeable or unchangeable, like a door is either opened or closed. It can't be open and closed. Well, when I finally realized that he was speaking within a completely different context than I was, and as he continued with these Aristotelian syllogisms, with the law of the excluded middle, in a purely scholastic context, it's rather like trying to discuss general relativity in terms of geometry, the Euclidean geometry, as if George Bernard Riemann had never existed, and without any knowledge of tensor calculus or anything like that. So you realize that there would have been no point in trying to discuss the antinomianisms in Orthodox theology and in quantum mechanics, either one. In the context that the question was being asked, one could not really engage it in any meaningful manner, because responding with Orthodox Christian concepts about God, the nature of God, the existence of God, the knowability or unknowability of God, responding with an Orthodox Christian concept to this kind of Aristotelian syllogism. The young man probably was studying logic, and maybe first-year logic. Well, you can't really respond that way any more than, as I said, any more than you can discuss Einstein's general relativity in terms of Euclidean geometry. You have to take a completely new kind of geometry, something I believe George Riemann in Germany was the first one to really discuss this kind of geometry with the curvatures of space-time and that sort of thing. And so one is sometimes put into that kind of a corner. And when you respond in that kind of a situation, you really have to say, well, look, this is something that we would have to discuss at some length. Very often you'll be pressed, though. I demand an answer, it's this way or that way, it can't be any other way. And this is one of those places where we see a certain complementarity between Orthodox theology and quantum mechanics. You cannot give an absolute answer. Sometimes we answer with antinomies. Something is and isn't at the same time. And this is practically incomprehensible to a scholastic mind, or to someone who's taken simple Aristotelian logic or something, and wants to argue on these basic principles of basic syllogisms. So we do encounter those things at times, and our response is difficult. And what I'm really doing here is trying to suggest that if you're in a position where you speak like that in public, and there's the possibility of receiving questions like that, that we try to think out some of these things ahead of time and how to respond to them. I mean, ultimately, one can say, well, we're not talking about doors being open or closed. We're talking about God who's quite beyond ordinary logical descriptions. Remember that the resurrection is foolishness to those who don't believe. It was foolishness to the Greeks because, of course, the Greeks thought that the body was something you wanted to get rid of, not something that you wanted to have raised from the dead and restored your union with. So anyway, these questions do come up, and I'm going to invite you, if you come up against a question like this, in a situation where you really can't give an appropriate answer, and you've had that experience, I'd like to ask you to share the experience with me, because I want to think a great deal about this and discuss it with some of my colleagues and ask how they've responded in similar situations, and to say how I've responded in some situations of the same type. In a certain sense, you can say that God changes. What we're talking about, knowing God through his uncreated energies. And in a scholastic mind, they're likely thinking about knowing God in his essence, or knowing the essence of God. And it's very tedious and difficult to explain this difference. And you can't really, in a short time, when you've just got a short moment to answer. Well, what I would like to do, though, is to catalog some of the events or occasions when some of you have been faced with this, and, as I said, discuss it with some of my colleagues, and then think about how to give a satisfactory response in terms of it's not possible to answer this thing in the short time that we have, and without a longer discussion of an Orthodox Christian concept about God and the knowledge of God. So I'll ask any of you who can to respond, and then we'll go on with the Old Testament is About You broadcasts.